Transhumanists out there, I've got some bad news. In 10 to the 32 years, all your protons and neutrons will decay away. And in less time than that, just trillions of years from now, we're going to experience a heat death of the universe, where thermodynamics will no longer be capable of moving energy from hot sources to cold sources. But hey, in just 2 million years, the sun will be too hot for any kind of advanced life to exist on Earth. So I would encourage you, when you look at your investment portfolio, those long-term investments, you want to shorten them to be less than 2 million years. Okay, but that's not what I'm here to speak about. I'm here to actually talk about a primary mission of Reasons to Believe, how we integrate the book of nature that God has given us with the book of Scripture, and I'm going to basically demonstrate that by looking at the first page of the Bible. But as mentioned earlier, we do take questions on Facebook and Twitter. So we're going to have a Q&A time, but recognize you can ask questions of us later. And hey, if you haven't already subscribed to our YouTube channel, do that. We literally have thousands of video clips that we're posting up there, and every week we're posting new ones. And yes, we still got copies of our free book at the back, Testable Faith. Scan that QR code and you'll get a copy of that. But I'm going to be focusing on the first page of the Bible, and this book, Navigating Genesis, takes you through all the objections from skeptics about the reliability of the first 11 chapters of Genesis. And many people lose their faith when they read the Bible's first page. For me, those pages were a huge step in making Jesus Christ my master and my personal Savior. And what I want to demonstrate for you in the next few minutes is how the more we learn from the book of nature, the more evidence we get that Genesis got everything right in its statements about the order of creation events and the details of creation. Testing Genesis with advancing science. Now, you already heard a little bit about this in my first talk about cosmic reasons to believe in Jesus Christ. And when you look at the very first verse of the Bible, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, I've done a lot of debates with atheists, and it's amazing how many of them pick up on this first verse and say, this is where the Bible got it dead wrong. We know from astronomy that the universe is first and the earth is later. And here it's saying they're both created at the same time. The problem is these skeptics are not recognizing the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. Hebrew has a small vocabulary size. English, more than 4 million words. In Hebrew, they don't have a word for the universe. Instead, they have this phrase, the heavens and the earth. Now, I grew up in Canada. I had to be fluent in French as well as English. French has a very small vocabulary size. And how you become fluent? You memorize thousands of idioms. Well, one of these idioms in Hebrew is the heavens and the earth. It means the entirety of physical reality, all matter, energy, space, and time. So Genesis 1:1 isn't speaking about the earth. It's speaking about God creating the physical universe. And yes, in my first lecture, I talked about these space-time theorems, which now prove that the Bible got it right, that indeed there's a beginning, not just to matter and energy, but space and time itself. Alexander Vilenkin, as I pointed out, made the point that, hey, we can no longer avoid the idea that there must be an agent beyond space and time that created anything. Science has now proven beyond any reasonable shadow of doubt, at a minimum, a deistic view of reality. There must be an agent beyond space and time that created our universe of matter, energy, space, and time. Now, often I run into scientists who say, I want to have you show me, you're a Christian, show me incontrovertible scientific evidence for a miracle. I said, well, what bigger miracle could a scientist ask for than the miracle of all the totality, physical reality coming into existence? A miracle-working God must exist because we have undeniable scientific evidence now that there is a miraculous event where all matter, energy, space, and time came into existence. Well, I want to spend the rest of my time taking you from Genesis 1:2 to Genesis 1:31. Actually, I'm going to go all the way to Genesis 2:4. And it was my wife, when I met her, she said, hey, when you're talking to people in churches or schools, it's not like Caltech. where you can have a 30-point message. You need to boil it down to 3 points. So these are my 3 points. Okay, we're going to look at the point of view for the creation days, the meaning of the word day that's used in Genesis 1, and then we're going to spend most of my time looking at the description of the creation events and the order in which they're described. Okay, point number 1. Now, when I opened up the Bible, it wasn't until I was 17 that I really gave the Bible any kind of serious read. But I was taught in the Canadian public education system. We got taught the scientific method in grade 1. We got it taught again in grade 2. We got it taught all 12 years. I was steeped in the scientific method before I opened up the Bible. But the moment I opened up the Bible, beginning right on page 1, Genesis chapter 1, the scientific method leapt right off the page. Step 1 of the scientific method: do not interpret until you establish the point of view or the frame of reference. Step 2, don't interpret until you also establish the starting conditions. Well, notice for Genesis 1:1, the point of view is the universe. But when you get to Genesis 1:2, it changes the point of view from the universe to the surface of the waters of planet Earth. This is huge because so many scientists and skeptics will say everything in Genesis 1 is scientific nonsense. It is if you got the wrong point of view. If you leave the point of view above the earth as if God is telling us of what's happening from his heavenly perspective, then almost everything in Genesis 1 is scientific nonsense. But if you put the point of view where the text puts it, on the surface of the waters of planet Earth, below the clouds, not above the clouds, as you're going to see, everything is in the correct chronological order and correctly described. The Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters of planet Earth. That's the frame of reference in which we're to interpret the 6 creation days. Now, there are 3 other biblical texts that take you through the 6 creation days, though not chronologically. You got Job 37, 38, and 39. You got Psalm 104 and Proverbs 8. So I share with people, don't really come to an interpretation of Genesis 1 until you look at what the rest of the Bible's got to say about the events of creation. But when you go to Job chapter 38, it gives clarification on this frame of reference. You've got God speaking, and he says, I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness. It referring to the waters that cover the surface of the earth. So notice that Job 38 is explaining why it's dark on the face of the waters. Genesis 1:2, Spirit of God is hovering over the surface of the waters. Then it gives us 4 initial conditions. It's dark on the surface of the waters. The waters cover the whole surface of the earth, and the world is formless and void. It's empty of life and unfit for life. But now the Spirit of God begins his miracles of creation work. So here in Job 38, it explains why we have this pervasive darkness. It's dark because of the clouds. Now, there was light in the universe when God created the universe, but it was dark on the surface of the waters because the clouds of the early earth were opaque to light. Now, I did have an advantage as a 17-year-old. I knew that planets the size of the earth, the distance that Earth is from the sun, would have an atmosphere about 200 times thicker than it has today. An atmosphere that thick will not let any visible light get through to the surface of the earth. It was dark on the surface of the waters. So if you remember nothing else from my talk this afternoon, remember this. The frame of reference is the surface of the waters below the clouds, not above the clouds. It was Galileo who said the biggest mistake you can make in Bible interpretation is to get the wrong point of view. That makes all the difference in how we interpret Genesis chapter 1. Now, I know some of you are capable of remembering 2 things. So, number 2, the meaning of the word yom that's translated day. It's got 4 distinct literal definitions that you'll find in any Hebrew lexicon. It can mean part of the daylight hours, like from noon to 3 p.m. It can mean all of the daylight hours. It can mean one calendar day of 24 hours or a long but finite period of time. Now, I didn't know this at 17 years of age, but as I read through Genesis 1, right away I realized this word day in the original language must have three distinct literal definitions, because three are actually used on the first page. So when you get to creation day 1, it uses the word day for the daylight hours. Creation day 4, it's contrasting seasons, days, and years. That's day is 24 hours, but when you get to Genesis 2:4, it uses that same word day to refer to the entirety of creation history. That's day as a long period of time. The other thing I noted at age 17, after each creation day, you got this evening morning phrase. And in the original, it reads, evening was, morning was, day 3, day 4, day 5. And I didn't know what the words evening and morning meant in the original language, but I knew at a minimum it was telling us each of these creation days has a definite start time and a definite end time. It also implies that the days are consecutive, that the end of creation day 3 is the beginning of creation day 4. But when I got to the seventh day, I noticed there's no evening morning phrase. It's missing, which implies we're still in God's seventh day. And that's actually explicitly stated in both Psalm 95 and Hebrews 4, that we're still in God's seventh day. So that explains why there's no evening morning phrase for the seventh day. We're in the seventh day. Now, I remember reading that at age 17, and it was a huge light bulb moment for me. Now, part of my story was I was a real nerd about physics and astronomy. I was reading 4 or 5 books on physics and astronomy every week from the time I was 7 years of age. And for some reason, my parents thought I was being obsessive about my studies in physics and astronomy. I didn't think so, but they thought so. And so when I was not quite 11 years of age, they bought our family a big, thick book on evolutionary biology. And I was the only one in the family that read it. But I remember telling my parents, Mom, Dad, the numbers don't work. Before humans, we see all this evidence for new families, new orders, new classes, new phyla. But once we get humans, none of that happens. And they said, well, we have no idea. Talk to your science teachers. My science teacher said, we have no idea. Go talk to those science professors, you know. Nobody could give me an answer until I read Genesis chapter 1. For 6 days God creates. On the seventh day, he stops creating. So that explains why we see new phyla, classes, why we see new orders and families before the existence of humans, and we see none of that after the existence of humans. For 6 days, God creates. On the seventh day, he stops creating. Now, we as followers of Jesus Christ, we obey the Sabbath. We work 6 days, and we celebrate the Sabbath. The principle of the Sabbath is we stop our regular work employment to focus on the most important issues of life. And I mentioned in my first talk that before God created anything, he started his works of redemption. For 6 days God creates. What does he do in day 7? He completes his work of redemption. And it tells us in Romans 8:23, the moment that God brings a full number of humans into a redeemed state, the universe will have fulfilled its purpose, and he will remove the universe from existence and replace it with a new creation. Day 7 will end. So God's Sabbath will come to an end, and he will create again. And I don't know how many creation weeks God's got on his future calendar, but we do know the seventh day will come to an end, but not until God's work of redemption is finished. So just like us, we focus on the most important issues of life on the seventh day. Likewise, God completes the most important purpose for his creation on his seventh day. You can read more about this in my book, A Matter of Days. And yes, just like the other books, you can get a free chapter at reasons.org/Ross. Well, let's get to point 3, which is the creation events, the 6 days of creation. And it begins with the statement, let there be light. What's important here is it's using the Hebrew verb hayah, not the verbs bara and asa that Fuzz talked about in his message. And so it's letting the light be. It's not God creating the light. When did he create the light? In the beginning, when he created the universe. That's the creation of light. But that light does not appear on the surface of the waters of planet Earth until day one. And so this is when God transforms our atmosphere from being opaque to being one that allows light to come through. But it's a hazy atmosphere. You can't see the objects beyond. But light now appears on the surface of the earth. And then you've got the phrase that the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. It uses a special Hebrew verb for hover, only used one other time in the Bible in Deuteronomy, referring to an eagle, a female eagle hovering over her eggs at the moment that the eggs are about to hatch. Consequently, many theologians have concluded the origin of life is at the beginning of creation, day one. And so this is consistent with what you heard Fuzz talk about in the Q&A, how we know that life originated on planet Earth at the earliest possible moment that the physics and chemistry would allow life to exist. So life was present throughout the entirety of the 6 creation days. And then we move into creation day 2. It's the shortest statement about the creation days. All it says is, let there be water above and water below. And this has led to a lot of debate among Bible scholars. What's the meaning of the water above and the water below? Well, one way to settle that debate is to go to the book of Job. 3 whole chapters. There's way more science content on creation in Job than there is in Genesis chapter 1. And the book of Job devotes 1.5 entire chapters to creation day 2. So given that the book of Genesis post-dated the book of Job, there is no need for Moses to get into all these details of creation day 2. That had been done to a great extent in the book of Job. And what you see in the book of Job, it speaks about water above and water below, but puts it in the context of a water cycle. How water above falls as rain to the earth, it evaporates and makes more rain. It's referring to the water cycle. But as you get into the book of Job, it actually expands on the water cycle and talks about how there's multiple forms of liquid precipitation and multiple forms of frozen precipitation. So you got rain, you got mist, you got dew, and in the case of the frozen, snow, frost, and hail. And we now know from science, we need all 6 of these forms of precipitation to have global human civilization. You know, the amazing thing about the snow, the hail, and the frost, it can form all over the surface of the earth, even in equatorial zones. So if you go to Ecuador, for example, there's a mountain right on the equator. It's got 6 giant glaciers on it. And the wonderful thing about the frozen precipitation, it melts very slowly. So it explains why all over the world we have rivers and streams that run all year long. Now with liquid precipitation, the rain falls and very shortly it runs out into the ocean. But the frozen stuff melts very slowly. So it allows us to have these steady rivers and streams which enable us to irrigate all of our agricultural plains and produce an abundance of food. Then we move into creation day 3. It says, let dry ground appear. Now, I was reading this at age 17, and this was a time when the geology textbooks were basically saying the continents have always been here. So I was saying, hey, the Bible says there is a time when there is no land at all, but the textbooks are actually saying that we have the continents always existing. But I remember in my teenage years reading these geology textbooks and realizing it's simply an assumption. There was no scientific data to back up the statement. Then I entered the University of British Columbia, and as a sophomore student, there were 2 of the 3 scientists that had launched the discipline of plate tectonics. And 2 of those scientists says, we're going to teach a class on plate tectonics. It's the first university course on plate tectonics that was taught anywhere in the world. And I wanted to get into that class. It was filled with graduate students, but somehow I managed to convince the professors to let me attend the class. And what they were sharing in that class is, well, actually, now that we understand at least something about plate tectonics, this is what happens. The amount of land that covers the surface of the Earth gets greater and greater as plate tectonics continues over the history of the Earth. And I remember walking up to one of the professors and saying, I noticed you have it starting at about 7% of the surface of the Earth. Is it possible that it's 0? He said, oh yeah, that's anywhere between 0 and 10%. We don't know that yet. So I says, oh, maybe Genesis got it right, that it actually starts at 0. Well, go forward 40 years, year 2000, thanks to very extensive worldwide seismology measurements, geophysicists had established this picture of the growth of the continental land masses. The story was that the Earth indeed begins as a water world, then you get small volcanic islands, and then a little bit less than half the Earth's present age, you get a very aggressive period of continental landmass buildup, mainly because of the first great oxygenation event. So I thought, well, you know, the science is putting it a little bit less than half of Earth's present history. Where does Genesis put it? The beginning of creation, day 3. I said, that's consistent. Okay, flash forward to 2018, and a group of physicists begin to study in detail what's referred to as the deep oxygen cycle. I described that in detail in my book, Designed to the Core. But basically what they show is that there aren't volcanic islands to start with. It takes time for the volcanoes to get going. You actually have a water world for at least the first half billion years. No land at all, and then plate tectonics begins to slowly kick in, but you don't get anything dramatic happening until the first great oxygenation event, and it's that event that is responsible for 90% of the coverage of the surface of the Earth by land masses. So you get this very dramatic growth, sudden growth at the continental landmass, then a very slow buildup thereafter. Now what you're seeing here is that the more we learn about the geophysical history of our planet Earth, the tighter and tighter fit we get with what Genesis taught thousands of years ago. And hey, if you want to read about it, I put out a regular blog series called Today's New Reason to Believe. And in the June 11th, 2018, it's still posted up on our website. You can read a lay-level article where I describe what these physicists were able to discover, basically proving that Genesis indeed got everything correct in considerable detail. But God's not finished. On creation day 3, we get this added statement, let the land produce vegetation. Now the word chosen for vegetation would apply to any photosynthetic life form. And these are the vegetation organisms that are basically taking carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, water from the atmosphere, making sugars, starches, and fats, which is the base of the entire food chain. It's also pumping oxygen into the atmosphere while it does that and removing carbon dioxide. Now, I've debated the executive director of the Skeptic Society, Michael Shermer, at 4 different times on university campuses. In each of those debates, and by the way, the subject of the debate has never been the Bible or Genesis. It's always been, is there evidence for creation in science? But no matter what, he basically goes after Genesis, and Genesis 1 in particular, and in private conversations I have with him, he views Genesis 1 as the Achilles heel of the Christian faith. So I remember the first debate I had with him, he said, Hugh, this is where Genesis gets it dead wrong. The fossil record tells us we get animals in the oceans before we get any kind of vegetation on the continents. Now my response at that time was, well, Michael, animals have bone skeletons, they got shells, that's going to be well preserved for a long period of time in the fossil record. That's not true of vegetation. It decays. It's not going to leave fossil evidence that's going to remain for more than 500 million years. But what happened in 2009 is a paper got published in the British journal Nature where they said, we've not found the fossils, but we have found the isotope signatures that demonstrate that vegetation was abundant on the continents for at least 200 million years before animals show up in the oceans. Then come 2011, they said, we've now found the fossils. Well, they haven't found complete fossils, but they found fossil parts. The biggest part they found was 1 millimeter in diameter, so a little tiny, but that's all you'd expect from vegetation that had been around for over 500 million years. But again, all over the world, they found these very tiny fossil parts, demonstrating that vegetation indeed had been abundant on the continental land masses for at least 600 million years before the first appearance of animals in the ocean. And again, this is demonstrating the more we learn about the fossil record, the more and more we see that Genesis got it right, the tighter and tighter fit we get with what Genesis taught thousands of years ago. Creation Day 4, it says, let there be lights in the sky. It's important to note here the text does not say that God created the lights. They were created in the beginning, Genesis 1:1. But this is the first time those lights become visible in the sky to creatures on the surface of the earth. This is evident from the rest of Genesis 1:14. Let there be lights in the sky so that they may serve as signs to mark seasons, days, and years. Now, what life needs to see those signs? The microbes don't need it. The vegetation doesn't need it, but the animals do. And God creates the animals in day 5. And for those animals to actually be able to live, they need to know, at least on occasion, the position of the sun, moon, and stars in the sky. These are life forms at a level of complexity. They have to find a way of regulating their biological clocks. And they're regulated by the positions of the sun, moon, and stars in the sky. Now, here is a history of the oxygenation of the Earth's atmosphere. So what you see is that about 2.5 billion years ago, you got the first great oxygenation event, which was responsible for that sudden growth of continental landmass. But then you get a second great oxygenation event where the oxygen jumps from 1% to 2%. Then you get a very sudden leap from 2% to 8%. Now, it was a team of physicists back in 2018 that said, we're going to do an experiment. They had this giant flask. They filled it with the known atmospheric constituents of Earth's atmosphere, and then they gradually increased the oxygen content to see what would happen, starting from less than 1% up to 2%, and they pushed it up to 8%. Now, I'm going to give you a simulation of what they saw in their flask experiment. And the simulation is a view of a mountain 0.5 kilometer away. This is Engineer Peak in Colorado, 0.5 kilometer away, where you got only 2% oxygen in the atmosphere. So with 2% oxygen in the atmosphere is so hazy, even though there's a mountain 13,000 feet high, that's just 0.5 kilometer away, you can't see the mountain. However, when we push the oxygen content up to 4%, you begin to vaguely see that there's something through the haze. As you push it up to 5%, you can tell, hey, it's starting to look like a mountain. And as it gets to 6%, you begin to say, yeah, there really is a mountain there. And then it gets to 7%. And when it hits 8%, the atmosphere clarifies. It becomes transparent. And now you begin to see something in the sky you couldn't see in the previous images. The moon shows up and basically shows that if you put enough oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere, the atmosphere transforms from a thick haze to where it now becomes clear. Now, if you visit some big Asian cities, it basically goes back to that thick haze where you can't see anything through the atmosphere. So there's an advantage to living in a place like West Virginia, where the sky is clear enough that you can actually see the sun, moon, and stars in the sky. And hey, if you want to read about it, I got a blog on it that came up on June 18, 2018. In fact, all you got to do if you want to see this stuff, go to reasons.org, put Creation Day 3 in our search engine, Creation Day 4. Both of these articles will pop up, and you can look at the scientific details in lay language. But now we move into Creation Day 5. Let the waters teem with living creatures. And so this is when God creates life in the oceans and says there's swarms of these living creatures, basically making it clear that now the waters are filled with a superabundance and super diversity of life forms. Now, this has been a profound challenge to people trying to interpret the history of life from a naturalistic perspective. Because what we notice is that the moment the oxygen jumps from 2% to 8%, you immediately have animals. There's no time delay. Evolutionists would predict that there would be a significant period of time before you'd be able to see these creatures appearing. There is no time lapse. They appear immediately. So the moment it hits 8%, you got animals as big as 2 meters across. Before that, all you have is microbes. For 3 billion years, nothing but microbes. Crucial because it takes 3 billion years of microbial activity to chemically transform the surface of the earth from being filled with soluble metals to having very few soluble metals. With a lot of soluble metals, that's toxic for plants and animals. So it takes 3 billion years of microbial activity to transform the planet where it's possible to have plants and to have animals. But the moment it hits 8%, you immediately have these animals, all different kinds of body plans and big as 2 meters across. But these are creatures without a digestive tract, without a circulatory system, because at 8%, you can't have animals that complex. They're all filter feeders. And then these creatures are driven to extinction by a geological event. What happens is the oxygen content suddenly jumps from 8% to 10%, but the moment it's 10%, you now got enough oxygen to have animals with a digestive tract, a circulatory system, a heart, a brain, a nervous system. And what's interesting, the moment it hits 10%, they immediately appear. No time delay. Moreover, what we notice is that we see the basic body plans of these animals showing up simultaneously and immediately. The fossil record reveals the opposite of what naturalistic theistic evolutionary models predict. Now, what you'd expect from a naturalistic perspective is that if you wait long enough, you get a proliferation of new species, and if you wait sufficiently long, you'll get a new genus. The proliferation of genera will produce a new family. The proliferation of families eventually will produce new orders, then new classes. Last of all, you get a new phylum. What's a phylum? A phylum is a basic body plan. And there's about almost 200 basic body plans that are mathematically possible. What we notice in that Cambrian explosion, virtually all the mathematically possible body plans appear, and they appear simultaneously. To give you an example, we human beings are part of the chordate phylum. That includes all animals that have a long neural cord. It includes all vertebrates. It also includes an abundance of invertebrates. So any animals that's defined by having a long neural cord, like what goes down our backbone, would be in the category of a chordate. And what we notice is those chordates are present at the very beginning of the Cambrian explosion. And so we notice in the Cambrian explosion, the phyla appear first, not last. They appear simultaneously, they appear suddenly, they appear as soon as physical and chemical conditions first permit their existence. This is the exact opposite of what you'd expect from a naturalistic perspective, but is exactly what you'd expect from a God that we see revealed in Psalm 104. Psalm 104 is the longest of the creation psalms, and its main theme is God is packing our planet with as much life as possible, as diverse as possible, as quickly as possible, and for as long as a period as possible. Why? Because all that is necessary so that we humans would have all the biodeposit resources we need to launch and sustain global civilization and technology. So what we notice is, with the Avalon explosion, the phyla appears suddenly, simultaneously, and immediately when the oxygen jumps from 2 to 8%. The Cambrian explosion, same thing. The phyla appears suddenly, simultaneously, and immediately when the atmospheric oxygen content jumps from 8 to 10%. And again, I can remind you, this is what the oxygenation history of that period of time looks like. Now, one of the most famous paleontologists in America is one called James Valentine. James Valentine and his team made this statement about the Cambrian explosion. He said the diversification of phyla occurs before that of classes, classes before that of orders, and orders before that of families. And he made the point, this is the opposite of what you'd expect if indeed the changes in life were being entirely generated by mutations, natural selection, gene exchange, and epigenetics. Those are the four mechanisms that will make natural changes in different life forms. But these are mechanisms that make relatively small changes, not big changes. Why they say we're going to get the species first, we're going to get the phyla last. What we see is the exact opposite of that. Gregory Ray, another expert in the Cambrian explosion, said this: the Cambrian explosion of body plans poses an outstanding problem for macroevolution. Or Kevin Peterson, elucidating the materialistic basis for the Cambrian explosion has become more elusive, not less, the more we know about the event itself. Again, another demonstration. The more we learn about the record of nature, the more evidence we see that Genesis got it right, that life gets here through God's supernatural interventions, not through strictly naturalistic process. Now, as you get into the rest of creation, day 5, you see for the second time only the use of the word bara. There's only 3 times you see the word create used in Genesis 1. For the creation of the universe, the second time for life forms that are not just physical, but also soulish. It's referring to the birds and the sea mammals. And he uses 2 verbs. It says that God created them and he made them. Reason for the 2 verbs: the physical part of these birds and sea mammals is not brand new. There are other creatures before them that had physical features. What is brand new is their soulishness. These are the first creatures endowed with mind, will, and emotions. These are creatures where the parents form emotional bonds with their offspring, and they can form emotional bonds with one another. And they're also designed to be able to form emotional bonds and serve and please a higher species. And so each one of them has been designed to form relationships with a higher species, namely as human beings, and to serve and please us. Now, the 3rd time you see the word bara is when God creates human beings. And again, it uses a sa bara. There's something about us that previously existed, our physical nature, our soulish nature. What's brand new is our spirit nature. And what does our spirit nature enable us to do? To form relationships with a higher being. So as these birds and mammals were created to form relationships with us and serve and please us, we were designed to form a relationship with the Creator and to serve and please the Creator. We alone have the capability of forming such a relationship because we are body, soul, and spirit. The other thing we notice about creation day 6, it skips over God creating the first land mammals. Sometimes you run into skeptics who say Genesis 5 puts the sea mammals first, Genesis 6 has the land mammals, and they say that's a contradiction. We know land mammals predated the sea mammals. That is correct. But the Genesis 1 never addresses when God creates the first sea mammals. Instead, what you see in Genesis 6 creation day, it jumps ahead to 3 specialized kinds of land mammals that God specially created to help launch civilization. The short-legged land mammals, referring to the rodents, then 2 kinds of long-legged land mammals, those that are easy to tame, referring to the herbivores, and those that are difficult to tame, referring to the carnivores. The herbivores for our agricultural activity, the carnivores are our companions. Those are the ones that we make pets out of. And so, again, it's making the point. If you go to the book of Job, it goes into detail about these birds and mammals that God created to launch civilization. And notice those places of the world where they lacked those animals, they never got out of the Stone Age. When humans went into Australia, they wiped out 94% of the large-bodied bird and mammal species that existed there. And they were stuck in the Stone Age until the Europeans brought the animals they needed. But where we had those animals, we were able to quickly launch civilization. But here's the bottom line. Once we understand that these days of creation in Genesis 1 are 6 consecutive epochs of time, and the frame of reference is the surface of the earth, we note this scientific accuracy for the creation events. It gets a score of 10 for 10 on the order of the events and 10 for 10 on the description of the events. And also gets a score of 4 for 4 on the initial conditions. Now, I looked at the other religions before I studied Christianity. I began by looking at the Vedas, I looked at the Buddhist commentaries, the Quran, I looked at some of the ones out of Persia, Zoroastrianism, Baha'i. The best I found outside of the Bible as a text on creation was the Enuma Elish of the Babylonians. It got 2 out of 14 right. You say, what about all the other creation accounts outside of the Bible? They all had a common score of 0. But the Enuma Elish, 2 out of 14. But in my book, that's still a failure. Only the Bible got a perfect score. And that proved to be a huge factor in giving my life to Jesus Christ, signing my name in the back of a Gideon Bible, making Jesus Christ not only my personal Savior, but also the master of my life. You can read more about this in Navigating Genesis. And yes, let me remind you about the free book we have outside. But here's the bottom line. The more we learn about science, the more we learn about God's book of nature, the more reasons we gain to believe that the Bible is God's word, inspired and inerrant in everything that it addresses. Thank you.